of his miniature railroad in the reality of the full-size trains. So he had lines incised inside and outside to make it look like individual planks of wood. All of the vertical elements have all of their detailing in place. In fact, if you look closely, you can see all the bolts cast in place. And it looks like they're crooked, they're out of line with each other. Well, on a full-size train, if the holes were all drilled in a straight line, it would actually weaken the wood and the car would fail more quickly. So even that detail was reproduced. You can also see initials and lettering painted on the car all the way around. It has the initials CP. The engine that Walt Disney chose to recreate for his 1/8 scale engine was the Central Pacific 173. This was a particularly beautiful Victorian engine. It had been broken up in 1909, but there were a lot of photographs and drawings of it, so Walt Disney was able to have the Disney Studio Machine Shop, headed up by Roger Brogy, recreate it precisely, and he named his railroad the Carrollwood Pacific. He was on Carrollwood Drive, and by naming it Carrollwood Pacific, he could use the same initials, CP, as Central Pacific, and so once again, he grounded the fantasy of his trains in the reality of the full size by using the same typefaces and the same lettering and labels on all of his cars. When this car was used in 1950 to 53, they would have put a little seat right here and a little seat right here, and two guests could sit inside with their feet tucked in and be pulled around the property. Now this engine did not actually belong to Walt Disney. This engine was built using the same plans as Walt Disney's Lily Bell engine. Walt Disney actually sold the plans and certain parts through a little company he set up called the Miniature Locomotive Company. In this way he was able to recoup some of his investment in this very expensive hobby. You'll notice that this engine is painted to represent Disneyland Railroad engine number 1. Walt would have loved to have had the Lily Bell be a part of Disneyland, but he knew based on experience that it didn't have nearly the capacity he would need. So he had the Disney Studio Machine Shop create a new Lily Bell engine that was in 5/8 scale, and that became engine number 1, the CK Holiday. So when you go to Disneyland, you will see an engine that is 5 times larger than this 1/8 scale engine, and 5/8 the size of the full-size Victorian original, with the exception of one important part, and that is the cab. Notice on this perfectly proportioned model that the roofline of the cab falls below the steam dome and the sand dome well below the stack. When you go to Disneyland, you'll see that this roofline is up above the steam dome and the sand dome and much higher to the stack. Furthermore, this roof has little peaks and little curves depending on which engine it is. This is because, as brilliant and creative as Walt Disney was, he could not come up with 5/8 scale people to serve as engineers and firemen in his trains. So they had to get as much room as possible inside the cab. Despite this, whenever they stand up in the cab, you will often see them bent over to one side like this. This is because they are out of scale to the rest of the Disneyland Railroad. Inside this cab, you can see all of the dials and levers and switches. Now I thought those were to decorate the inside of the cab when I first came here as a docent, but I was told no, those are actually used to operate this working steam locomotive. If you had a head of steam and the proper pressure for this locomotive, you could take a seat right here on this little padded cushion, looking out for Disney, for Mickey of course, and put your feet on these little stirrups, and then reach down inside this cab, and by manipulating the right dials and levers, this would actually pull out of the station and pull a whole string of cars around the property, just like you've seen people riding around today. Over in this corner is one of Walt Disney's workbenches. The painted pieces of furniture that you see in the barn were actually built by Walt Disney using power tools that he had out here. These are also a selection of tools and other things that Walt Disney used when he was working here in the barn. These came out of his toolbox. Here's a catalog for the Miniature Locomotive Company. Up here, in this corner, we have the electronic switcher board that I told you about, where Walt could actually operate the Lily Bell engine from inside the barn. There were little switches and little lights that would tell him where the Lily Bell was. In fact, here's a photograph of Walt Disney at the switcher board during one of the days that he had guests over to ride the trains. The antique telephone was actually wired up to the main house up at the top of the hill. It was operating. Walt could call up to find out if lunch was ready, or they could call down and tell him if he had company. Over in this corner, you see the sink, paper towel dispenser, the cup holder. These were all things that Walt would use on the weekends when he was down here working. On Sunday mornings, he would come down, he'd stand at the sink, he'd look in the little mirror that's on the wall there, and he would shave himself and get ready to greet his friends. Walt Disney loved to entertain friends with his trains. And his friends had such a good time that they started inviting their friends. And then they started inviting their friends. And well, it reached the point that Walt and Lily didn't know who might be at the door on a Sunday morning when the doorbell rang. And if they had children with them, they were too tender-hearted to turn them away. One Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1953, a guest was operating the Lilybell engine. And they took a corner a little bit too fast. The Lilybell jumped the track, fell on its side. All the kids ran over to see. Hot steam shot out, and a little girl got burned on the leg. Well, Walt and Lily talked it over and decided it was probably time to put the Lilybell engine away for a while. And besides, by the summer of 1953, Walt Disney was already thinking about a much larger place where he could entertain a lot more people. And that, of course, eventually became Disneyland. Now, the Lilybell was actually displayed at Disneyland for many years. Then a few years ago, the Lilybell went on a little bit of a tour. Lilybell was exhibited at 2 different presidential libraries, the Richard Nixon in Yorba Linda and the Ronald Reagan up in the Simi Valley. And today you can see the Lilybell and most of the rolling stock of the Carolwood Pacific Railroad at the Walt Disney Family Foundation Museum up in San Francisco. There are 2 cars on display at the Carolwood Room at the Wilderness Lodge at Walt Disney World in Florida. And of course, we're very proud to have 1 car on display here at Griffith Park in Walt Disney's barn. The track itself remained on the property until Lily Disney passed away in 1997. According to the terms of her will, the property was sold and the money was divided up among the heirs. The new owners wanted to build a much larger house, and so the family made arrangements to have the barn itself carefully disassembled and brought here to Griffith Park. The track that had been donated by Walt Disney to the Los Angeles Live Steamers was used to create the Disney Loop that is still in use today. The Live Steamers, organized in 1956, Walt Disney, Ward Kimball, and Olive Johnston were all members. That track, after many years of heavy use, became rather worn, and so it was taken up a few years ago and replaced with a new steel track. And so this section of track that you see here is the only existing section of track from Walt Disney's backyard railroad. The barn itself, as I said, was carefully disassembled and brought here to Griffith Park in 1999. It was reassembled with 80% of what you see is the original barn. The biggest change was the outside roof. The Griffith Park requires that all structures have fireproof roofs, and so the wood shingles were taken off and replaced with ones that are fireproof. Other than that, this is pretty much the way it looked when Walt Disney was here. The Live Steamers give free train rides to the public every Sunday from 11 to 3. The Carolwood Pacific Historical Society, of which I am a member, offers free tours of Walt Disney's Carolwood Barn on the 3rd Sunday of each month. We are the only regularly operating Disney attraction in the world that is absolutely free to the public. But we are also always welcoming of anyone who wants to make donations or join our organization. We have literature here, and if you have any questions about anything that I've been talking about or anything you've seen here in the barn, you can ask me or any of the volunteers wearing the Carolwood badges. Thank you very much.
Thank you.